Every toy in Poppy Playtime has a major weakness. In fact, these hidden flaws could potentially hint to the kind of toys we'll see in Chapter 4. Most of the toys we've encountered so far have deadly abilities, using them to try and take us down. However, like any mortal entity, these toys must have their own weaknesses. Let's start with Huggy Wuggy. One possible vulnerability for Huggy could be his reaction to children. He might become defensive and protective when kids are involved, a trait that could have ultimately led to his downfall. Imagine if someone grabbed Huggy's attention by pretending a child was in danger. He might become hesitant and unfocused on the source of the information, creating an opportunity for someone to attack. It's reasonable to think Huggy would act protectively towards the orphans, considering he was probably one himself. A lower-level employee named Rowan Stoll believed Huggy's eyes contained nanny cams because they seemed to move. We now know that these were his actual eyes moving, as he was a living creature. Rowan also noted that Huggy appeared to be watching the children, implying he was ensuring their safety and protection. Although there's no mention of Huggy having a protective instinct towards children in any of his experiment reports, who's to say we've seen all of the documents about the bigger body Huggy? There are likely multiple reports for each experiment. Another weakness of Huggy is his inability to handle falls from great heights. In Chapter 1, he fell and landed on multiple bridges and pipes on the way down, but couldn't grab hold of any of them. This could be due to the floppiness of his arms, suggesting he doesn't have many bones in these areas. Striking any of his joints that allow movement would likely be an effective way to weaken him. Assuming he returns in Chapter 4, this could be the key to defeating him once and for all. Next, let's talk about DogDay. Although we don't know much about him, a few potential weaknesses come to mind. Given that he's technically a dog, loud factory noises may disorient him, as dogs have extremely sensitive hearing, but he may have more weaknesses than just this one. When we meet him in Chapter 3, he clearly cares about Poppy and is on her side, likely because they both oppose the prototype and want him dead. However, it's also possible that DogDay was always loyal to Poppy, even before the chaos at the factory. In a scenario where DogDay hasn't had his legs torn off and been hung up in the playhouse, if something happened to Poppy, he might make irrational decisions that endanger himself and others. He may also be emotionally fragile. DogDay was the leader of the Smiling Critters, and he informed us that he was the last of them. His tone noticeably lowers when he says this, implying that the death of his friends emotionally devastated him, which is understandable. Another potential weakness worth mentioning is how his body reacts to not getting the necessary amount of food and water. The bigger body toys need to eat to survive, and it's likely that DogDay was designed to thrive on a nutrient-rich diet similar to actual dogs, much like how Boxy Boo's appetite was tailored to flesh. However, after being shackled for so long, DogDay probably hadn't consumed many nutrients in a long time, leading to his slow decay in isolation. Given that these toys need to eat, they probably also need to drink water. DogDay likely hasn't had anything to drink in a while either. These factors could explain why he sounds rather dehydrated and weak in-game, contrary to the bright voice he's implied to have in his cardboard cutout. Speaking of his cutout, he screams for an alarmingly long time at the end of it. This seems to mimic when Catnap tore his legs off. The fact that Catnap was able to cause so much damage suggests that DogDay wasn't much of a fighter, which could be another one of his weaknesses. Now, we mentioned that DogDay is one of Poppy's allies, but since Poppy is just a fragile plastic doll, she must have a few weaknesses of her own. Let's explore those. It's immediately clear that she has limited physical strength, no explanation needed there. However, she might be even weaker than we think. All the evidence points to the living version of Poppy being created before the Bigger Bodies initiative, and information from the orientation book and a Chapter 2 VHS tape heavily implies that she was Elliot Ludwig's daughter before being turned into this doll. If this is true, Poppy may naturally crave attention and companionship, especially after being locked in that case for so long. Long periods of isolation might emotionally weaken her by making her feel lonely. At first glance, this idea could be contradicted when acknowledging that in Chapter 3, Poppy gets us to leave the elevator while she stays there, but she supposedly only does this for our own safety, so it doesn't really count. Expanding on this idea, emotional manipulation may also be one of Poppy's biggest weak spots. If she truly needs to feel cared for, this aspect of her personality could be exploited. If someone pretended to befriend Poppy and later betrayed her, it could cause severe mental damage. Kissy Missy may have survived the attack at the end of Chapter 3, and she could return in the next chapter grinder under the prototype's control, likely acting hostile towards the player and Poppy. If this happens, we may see the effects of Poppy's vulnerability to betrayal. Another one of her possible weaknesses is flammability. Like other dolls, Poppy is likely highly flammable. If this is true, she must have escaped the train wreckage quickly, or she would be nothing more than a pile of ashes. Now, let's move on to Boxy Boo. One of his weaknesses could be exposure to severe cold. Given his jack-in-the-box design, his bigger body contains a lot of springs. Freezing temperatures might cause these springs to become brittle and break, or at least slow down his movements. This could mean he prefers to stay in warm areas, which is possibly why he was in the train during the cinematic trailer for the spin-off game Project Playtime. In Project Playtime, Boxy Boo is actually a playable monster, giving us insight into his unique abilities and their potential vulnerabilities. One of his capabilities is jumping very high and leaping across long distances. However, if his springy legs were damaged by something like glue or debris, it would completely neutralize this ability, making it much harder for him to catch his prey. Remember how Mommy Longlegs died? She got her arm trapped in a grinder, which led to her entire body being dragged in, resulting in a slow, agonizing death. One of Boxy's most unique abilities is to grab people with his claws and pull them in. However, this specialty of his is also a weakness. If he was chasing someone and accidentally lunged his hand at a grinder, he would suffer the same fate as Mommy. His final ability is to reach his head towards someone in a matter of milliseconds and then consume them instantly. This function could also be disrupted. The bigger body toys are organic, but some have internal mechanisms such as Poppy, as we saw from her maintenance video. It's very probable that Boxy would have mechanical parts given his spring-loaded design. If his internal spring mechanism were to get damaged or stuck, perhaps by another toy that he attempts to feed on, it could prevent him from being able to open his mouth wide, thereby preventing him from eating. This would ultimately result in him starving to death. And finally, let's talk about the prototype's most loyal follower, Catnap. Chapter 3 proved without a doubt that he was a dangerous experiment, especially considering what he did to DogDay. But he certainly wasn't immortal, not physically, and probably not mentally either. He must have had a fear of the prototype betraying him, even though he likely believed this had little chance of happening, especially given that the prototype saved Catnap when he was still an orphan. The fact that Catnap's loyalty to his god was so strong must mean there was at least a small amount of fear of betrayal. Now, as for his physical weaknesses, it makes sense that water could be one of them. Catnap had a gas dispenser at the back of his throat, which must be mechanical. If water made contact with this contraption, he would not only lose his iconic ability to breathe out red smoke, but could also suffer a fate similar to what he endured at the end of Chapter 3. After all, water and electricity do not mix. So, damp environments in the Playtime Co-Factory could have been particularly dangerous for Catnap. Given his name, Catnap, his bigger body may have been designed to need sleep. Lack of sleep could have significantly weakened him, making him too tired to perform his duties, or possibly even slowly killing him. It's known that Catnap's red smoke could sometimes cause nightmares when inhaled. Since Catnap was the bearer of the smoke, if he did sleep, it's possible he also suffered from nightmares. His own special ability could have also been his curse. Speaking of this red smoke, its dispensing device may have been produced in a way that generated excessive heat when used, similarly to how computer parts heat up when in use. Some of the toy's technology at the factory was flawed, so why wouldn't the inner workings of this gas dispenser be flawed as well? If this is true, and there were no efficient cooling mechanisms implemented, heat could have become a growing issue every time Catnap breathed out this smoke. He had his unique function, but at what cost? Now, although we've explored the weaknesses of the toys, there's an even bigger mystery about their behavior. Curious about how the toys are secretly communicating with each other? Check out this video here, and if you'd like to see more Poppy Playtime theories just like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. See you next time.